Well, we so I think, Linda, both of us have come into the situation working with boards of directors, where you have a very eager and very willing board that wants to listen to a lot of different factions and wants to be, um, engaged with people and get lot of diverse opinions and so forth. And sometimes you'll have a board member in their eagerness who will tell someone who's got a lot of opinions, well, if you want to create real change on the board, you should just become a board member. Then you can change anything you like. That can be a bit of a difficult situation for both the person joining the board with high expectations about what might be done, and also for the board itself, that's the board members who have been in place for a while, to begin to cope with those high expectations of a new board member. Have you ever encountered something like that, and have you seen any good ways of dealing with it?
Oh, well, thank you, Sherry. Yes, yes, I have, both in a structured way and a non-structured way. And let me just say what I mean about that, right? So some boards are very oriented towards, I think some boards may be treated more like advisory boards in the official sense of it. But, if you can have boards of directors that exist because they legally need to exist, and the organization is pretty much directed and run by a very strong executive director. Nothing, very powerful for that to happen, but especially in the nonprofit arena, you have executive directors that are powerful, strong, strategic leaders. And boards can often be the after the fact. So they'll get proposals and things and actually look to the leadership of the executive director, right? Mm-hmm. So in that sense, when I'm saying from an unstructured standpoint, if you could have, I've seen a board member come on that doesn't like the way that's going, tries to, has a different way that it needs to go and looks to convince the rest of the board members for that to happen. And there's not a very cohesive process by which you resolve that, right? So especially if there isn't anything agreed to ahead of time by the members of the board about how they want to structure or organize themselves or how they would deal with dissenting views, right? So they're there, they arrive, the agenda gets made for them by the executive director, they listen to reports, they nod their head as an agreement with that, and then they leave. So you have somebody coming on, testing that relationship or wanting to go in a different direction. There's no protocol by which you end up handling that. And it can become divisive, right? It can become personal, it become, this isn't the way it should be, or people have personal opinions about the executive director, about whether they should be having as much power as they do. So it can get, best way to say it is that it can get a bit messy, and then people make each other wrong, and it's not necessarily a very conducive environment for forwarding an organization. So I've seen that in a number of cases where it actually got physical, which is certainly not what you end up wanting to see in an organization, or somebody saying that they want to go public with what's going on. They have inside information about what's happening with an organization. And I've seen a situation where a board member actually wanted to threaten to say, I'm going to go to the news media with this if you don't kind of go in my direction. Mm. Right. I want to speak to, on the other hand, that if as a board you have, you've created some ground rules ahead of time. Mm. And this is like any group of people coming together, the first order of business, if you think about, so how are we going to operate with each other? How are we going to deal with dissenting views? Is it safe for somebody to say whatever there is to be said, that we can put things on the table and discuss it, and anything can be put there, and that we're open to hearing whatever is going on. So in that regard, inside of a structured way of interacting with each other, I've seen board members come on with a specific point of view, but actually willing to hear where does that fit with what's going on with the board's process that's happening. So it tends to create a more inclusive and collective environment.
So this Robert in the chat room brings up a good question, and I've encountered this also. So let's say the board has been very explicit in setting out its protocols or its policies or its processes about how it's going to conduct itself. Does a new board member have to play by the same rules? What if the new board member doesn't agree with the rules the old board set in place?
That's such a great question, of anything with any organization. So you come on and, hey, I didn't make that up, so it doesn't belong to me, right?
Yeah.
One thing that I've done with groups in advising them about new board members, that one of the orienting processes for a new board member is for them to look through all of the policies and all of the rules, and where can they find themselves, their own point of view in what's already written, or do they have any issues with any of it, so that all gets resolved during the orientation process, with the whole intention that you're joining a group. The group dynamic, of course, is going to shift because of a new member being there, but that there can be buy-in to what's already happening, and that they can agree, not out of obligation, but out of having actually looked through and saying, yeah, I can own this as if I had done it myself.
Yeah, that's as John noted, that's a great idea, Linda. I think it's really, and too often boards really don't take enough time in that orientation process. And another thing that might be useful for a new board member is to sit in on a few meetings before they decide if they want to join this kind of culture that's been established already, and being part of a culture that's already in place. So do you have any other ideas about how a new board member might be approached, and especially one who may have high expectations about being able to create change? I want to come on this board and make change happen. Any other ways to work with those expectations without impinging on that person's enthusiasm and excitement about being on the board?
Well, when your suggestion about actually attending a couple of board meetings ahead of time, I think if the board lays out in its leadership development, looking to replace itself or sustain itself over time, like wherever that function lies, whether in a nominating committee or otherwise, is looking at it from the perspective that this is a mutually agreed upon relationship, right? It's not like not only that it's going to work to forward what the board's up to, but also the individual, but that it's like the board getting to know who this new person might be, or those candidates who might be on the board, but also for them in attending a board meeting, is this some place where they can see what they're out to accomplish? Is this really the right vehicle for it? Because ultimately, a board is about the common voice, right? So when you're any other way, I'm thinking whoever engages with the new board members in their orientation, speaking to the fact that, what is it that you actually want to accomplish? And here's the board process. And where do you see that working, right? Because if a board creates a process to safeguard its agenda of what it's there to fulfill, no matter who changes over in the board, it really needs to come from an unmessable standpoint where, you don't mess with the board process, right? So this is how we have chosen to operate. I think that the aspect of having a new board member kind of review everything and say, can you buy into that? Or how would you change it? I think can be healthy for a board to actually stand back and review, what we've got set up. Is it arcane? Has it become useless? Or is this something that we would want to shift?
Yeah, I think and I'm going to combine a couple of questions that are coming up in the chat room, Linda. Robert has noted, well, what if I don't want to be part of the old boys club? So you just kind of addressed that, have we gotten stale? Have we gotten to the point where we need to begin to review where we are? And then John, I'm going to tie in John's question, which is, as part of that orientation for a new board member, should there be some discussion about, if you don't like the way things are, here's how you can change it?
Yes, absolutely. I think this is a two-way street, right? So anytime you change board members, it's often to, quote, bring in new blood. Well, that translates really down to the nuts and bolts of here's a fresh view on process. And is that something that, because the full group would need to align on it, is this something that would enhance us or update us or have us be relevant to what we're doing now? So it can be a very healthy process. And, when you think about it, from both the person coming on and the board itself, there's a prerequisite here, which is maybe not natural to human nature, but there's a prerequisite that people are coming with a full, what would you say, not a personal agenda that they're stuck to, or the board is out to be an old boys club, which can, truth be told, some people want to keep it that way, but that they're really there for the full intent of what they are, what they're there to exist versus their personal agenda or personal, I don't know how best to express it, but for, in the world where people are out for their own versus the good of the whole, there's a prerequisite that's at play here, right? That people are doing this for the best interest of the organization and nothing else. So they would look to be able to be open to change and be willing to look at it dispassionately.
Yeah, and and we have a few more minutes, so maybe just 2 more minutes. So I'd like to kind of tie this back to the role of the chair in facilitating some of these things. And if sometimes I'll have a chair who'll say, well, I've got this person who's really eager, who's a new person on the board, and they really want to get engaged with doing something. And I feel like I need to accommodate that. But we really don't have anything going on right now where they can, be hands-on or engaged. And, would you have any advice for that kind of chair who's really wanting to help that person get involved and engaged in the way they want to, but there may not be an immediate opportunity for something that they would consider meaningful? Or you have any thoughts about that?
Well, one thing that, when you were mentioning about the board chair, the thought that came to mind for me is somebody who sees themselves purely as a vessel, versus a personality. Yeah. But I often am thinking that when somebody comes on and they're particularly intent on something, right? They have a particular personal thing that they want to see changed, and they have a very clear idea about how they want to change it, and they want to convince others that this is the way to go. That as the chair, what I would say is to talk further with that person. There's some passion that's driving why they want that to be done and why they want that to be done in that particular way, and just explore with them a little further. Well, what is really underlying this? What's most important to you about what you're dealing with, and to see to how to connect that with something that the board is ultimately also committed to, but given the various challenges and facets of what's going on, that perhaps the particular way that this person wants it to be done may not actually work in some other area. So it's sort of a tactful, diplomatic way of not shutting them down, but always looking to connect. Where does their interest tie into ultimately what the board's about? Because that kind of diversity if they're willing to be open to considering it, could really enhance and expand on what the board could see might be available.
And in your experience, Linda, have you seen that most effective if it's one-on-one as opposed to at a board meeting, or would you just make it an open conversation?
It depends. It depends on what's going to, I think from a board chair standpoint, it depends. It could go either way, right? I think I've seen it when I've been a board chair that I've done that one-on-one with people because it was a particular volatile kind of situation, right? To have it in the full board, the person would feel like they might have been ganged up on. So talking with them one-on-one to be able to gain the trust and the viewpoint that is in a non-threatening situation. And then other times I've seen that people are quite open for having it in the full board discussion when they can trust that people are actually interested in hearing what their point of view is. I think one of the optimal board cultures is where anything can be said in the room, and especially if you might be the sole dissenting voice, that the remainder of the board would actually stop and want to find out from you what is it that's actually what the issue is that you're dealing with, and support you in getting that out into the table, which is kind of a, it's a pretty an ideal situation, but how amazing that would be that if you're the dissenting voice, the rest of everybody else is actually interested in getting that articulated in a way that it could get incorporated or viewed with everything else that's happening.
Well, this has been a great conversation, Linda. Lots of good advice that you've given about the importance of a board having designed some sort of way to have dialogue and some process for addressing things in advance, as opposed to letting it happen sort of ad hoc and evolve, is really important. And also some great advice to help the board chair facilitate issues that may come up that are difficult conversations that may need to be had. One more question from John Bruce, and we'll take this one and then we'll sign off.
Okay.
He's asking about the space for people who have issues that they want brought to the table. How do they get that on the agenda? How should that be addressed?
Well, a couple of ways. I mean, oftentimes it's taking it to the chairperson, right? And then the chairperson determines whether it goes on to the agenda or not. And that can be a very, if you have a board chair who's certainly willing to always look at something from the broad standpoint, but it could be a bottleneck for many organizations, right? Because you could have a board chair that's, I'm going to personally decide what we're going to talk about or not. The other thing that I've seen is that some boards will have some space in their board meeting that is purely board open time, that is separate from any particular defined agenda items that the board needs to get through. But this is an opportunity for anything to bring any topic up, and the full board could decide whether we want to bring this onto our agenda to deal with or how else it might get addressed.
Boy, that really highlights your earlier point about having a structured process, because if you don't, you may never get to that space.
Exactly.
So that's really important. Well, Linda, thank you so much for coming on and talking with us today. And we'll look forward to our next Fire Talk chat. Take care. And thank you, John and Robert, for joining us today.
Bye.
Bye.